So it's really nice for me to present today and to actually reflect on thinking about infrastructure, which wasn't something key to the work that we did on violence against women and girls. But also to think, it really helped me to think, what can an infrastructure focus actually add to work that I was doing on violence against women in London, migrant women in London, and then we also did some work, which I won't be talking about here, on violence against women in Brazil. And so it's been a really interesting process for me to think about, thinking through particularly the notion of gendered infrastructural violence that Iona's already spoken about. And at the beginning, I'd also just like to say, and I'll explain it as I go along, that I'm talking about mainly one project here, but I'm going to say a little bit about another one. And both of them have been very collaborative, and the key to the collaborations in both places were actually a women's rights organisation here called the Latin American Women's Rights Service, and we have one of our advisory board members here as well. So they were the key partner in both of the projects that I'm going to be talking about, but there are lots of other partners as well, some representatives from those in the room, and I'll explain those as we go through. So partly being on the advisory board of Iona and the team's project, as well as speaking here today, the work that we did wasn't strictly thinking about urban space, lighting, or digital infrastructures at all. But what I found really interesting was to think about, okay, well, actually, a lot of the work that we have been doing in London does link to these infrastructural debates, particularly around infrastructural violence. And again, so thinking, which is again, Iona's already spoken about, thinking about the importance of gendering these infrastructural violence debates. Firstly, because they're deeply relational, as we can see here. But also, there's one of the key pieces, which is the Roger and O'Neill piece, doesn't actually mention women or gender at all. And it talks about intersectionality. And I was really quite surprised to see it mentioned nothing about women and gender, those of you who have read it. And so, obviously, it also means that the work that the team's been doing is incredibly important. But I think that there are lessons much more broadly as well. So in terms of thinking about sort of the post-colonial, which again I'll mention a little bit about, because obviously I'm talking about migrants are coming from, say, the post-colony of Brazil and then coming to London, which arguably could be a post-colonial city, could be a post-imperial city. That's not the debate to get into here. But certainly in terms of various power relations, which I will be talking about in relation to the work that we did on the ground, I think are really important. And I think, obviously, with the exception of the work that we've just heard about, a lot of the work on gender and infrastructure, which is really, really good, does tend to focus on the nuts and bolts of infrastructure rather than gendered infrastructural violence. So what I wanted to look at was this relationship in the context of, which again Iona's just mentioned, masculinist urban planning and the active and passive ways that works. And Iona's just given us some really nice examples of active and passive forms of exclusion, which are forms of violence. And also the ways in which lack of access to that actually facilitates gender-based violence. So in terms of, and again, this is coming into the work that I've been doing, I was thinking, gosh, I don't really work on infrastructure. And then I thought, but hang on a minute, both in London and the work that we did in Brazil, we did a service mapping, which was access to services. So where did women go when they experienced violence? And so we interviewed organisations. Rosanna's here for the team who was in charge of that from our Brazilian research team. We did it in Rio de Janeiro, and we did it in London. And so when I started to think about it, I thought, well, access to this service provision and this support for women, or exclusion, depending on the services that they are trying to access, is a form of infrastructural violence, which has really important implications for whether or not gender-based violence occurs, and obviously not the deeply rooted causes of it, or whether it can be prevented. Very briefly, I'm not going to say very much about this, but again, it ties into what Iona has spoken about the need to look at violence against women and girls across, we've called it a spectrum here, other places we've called it a continuum, but the fact there are lots and lots of different types of gendered violence, which we need to think about at these different scales. And here, because we're talking about international migrants, we also included the transnational scale. And this is a very common way of thinking about violence against women and girls, particularly based on Liz Kelly's work in the 1980s. Again, very, very briefly, I'll just skip through this really quickly. And I thought it was also interesting that your project also includes migration, but rural-urban migration, and the way that disrupts what happens in households, what happens at communities. And I think that's certainly something that we've looked at internationally in terms of our research. But also, I think which is the top point, and this is work that Sylvia Chant and I have done, which is really important to think about the relationality globally, links between cities. What happens in Rio de Janeiro actually does affect, or in Brazil in general, affects whether and how women actually do end up migrating to London, to the US, to other European countries. And also looking at which, it sounds like that's what came out from the work that you've been doing, the ways in which migration destabilizes, reinforces and remakes gender norms, gender identities, and so on. And then gender-based violence within that. Sometimes gender-based violence is reduced, but often it's intensified as it relates to other types of violence. And so I was trying to think through all of this in my head, and I thought, well, I'll just put it into something graphic. Otherwise, I'll get myself in a muddle. But really, and Iona's already spoken about it, it's about thinking about the relationships between gender-based violence, violence against women and girls, and gendered infrastructural violence, and then how this relates to structural violence. This is the Galton Farmer exclusion, uneven global development, gendered power inequalities, however those are played out in different places, and symbolic violence, all of which Iona's already mentioned. This relates to, again, forms of discrimination according to different types of intersectionality. And then how that links with service provision and support and gendered infrastructural violence. Okay, so in terms of the sort of the actual project and what we did, these are all, I said there was lots and lots of people. Redis de Marais have got a rather nice flashing symbol, which I didn't realise it flashed until last night. But these are all the people that we worked with. I'm not talking about the Brazilian work here. So we've got Rosanna from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro here, who was on that team. We worked with an NGO called Redis de Marais in Rio, and People's Palace Projects. Paul Heritage was the co-I on the project, and it was an ESRC Newton Fund project. And then in London, again, I've mentioned the Latin American Women's Rights Service, and we worked with a theatre group that I'll mention in a moment, and also the Step Up Migrant Women work is something which is the new work that we've just finished that I'll mention in a moment. But basically, it revolves around the fact, and this is not looking at the Rio case, looking at the London case, around the ways in which women can access support, migrant women access support from statutory and non-statutory services. And the ways in which that intersects with different types of violence. So these are women who have all experienced some form of gender-based violence. Broadly speaking, again, Iona said, it's not just about intimate partner violence that we're focusing on here, we're focusing more broadly. Methodologically, we did survey work, we did in-depth interview work, we did focus group work, and then the service mapping that I've mentioned. And then the last project, which I'll just say a little bit about, was working not just with Brazilian women, because we worked just with Brazilian women in the first project. The second one, we worked with women from 22 different countries, migrant women with insecure immigration status who had experienced violence in London and their experiences. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing that I'll say, and I'll come back to it, is the photographs that you see here are from a play that we made, which we then have made into a policy film and then a sort of a much more art-based film, which I've got a slide at the end and I'll just say something about. But that's why these pictures keep coming up, and this is the Brazilian playwright and actress that, who created this play. So in terms of the incidence, the intensity of violence against women and girls, this is not just intimate partner domestic violence. This is violence across that continuum, across that spectrum. And we found that over 80% of women across their life course had experienced some form of violence, often in the public sphere, which again I think very much links into the Disconnected Infrastructures project, and 30% of that was in the private sphere. The most commonly, I mean, there's lots of different types, which I'll explain in the next slide, lots of different types, but in terms of these sort of core categories, which are sort of standard categories that are used in this type of work, emotional violence, psychological violence was the most important, followed by physical and sexual. And obviously, these types of violences, of course, interrelate, and you can experience them simultaneously and so on. One other thing that was really important, and I'll just mention really briefly, is that the emotional psychological violence, women often recognise this once they actually consult specialist support services, when they, for example, pick up a leaflet and then say, oh my goodness, I have been actually suffering from this type of violence for 10 years and didn't actually realise it. And so this is just a quote from someone that we interviewed talking about that. And it's often not when they go to get support for help with, obviously, with domestic violence, it's when they go to find out about housing, about immigration, about workplace exploitation or something. So I said, what we found, one thing I also just want to say, I'm calling it Vogue. That's what is used in the sector. But it's also really important that we don't just call it like this sort of acronym all the time. Some people don't actually use it, but it's just really hard to say violence against women and girls all the time. But there is a debate around should we use this acronym because it depoliticizes it. So I meant to say that at the beginning, and I forgot, actually. So it's hugely diverse. On the right-hand side, we went through some of our in-depth interviewing, and actually, I should say Yara Evans was the research assistant on it, who did all this really brilliant work as well on the London side. And, we found women across their life course experiencing multiple types of violence. And we just put them, there's just a couple here. I mean, they're really, really quite awful across different spaces. And there's just an example of a woman there who, lots of different types of threats to her in different ways. But what was also really interesting is that almost 80% experienced violence before they left Brazil, but then suffered it again when they arrived in London. Sometimes women were fleeing partners. Often there was a real issue that women ended up talking about, opening up about, which was incestuous sexual abuse back home in Brazil, linked with gendered power inequalities. But also women would maybe migrate with the perpetrator, and then because of various exclusions and problems that they experienced in London, then that violence would often intensify, or they experienced new types of violence in London for the first time. That might be because they met a new partner, or it could be in terms of intimate partner violence, or they experience lots of or different types of violences in the public sphere. We came across some cases of trafficking and forced labour, as well as lots and lots of labour exploitation. But this was a specific case of a woman who was brought to work as a nanny and had her passport confiscated, and then was forced not just to work as a nanny and in childcare, but also to work as a cleaner with her boss from very early in the morning till late at night. And her visa expired, and she was stuck. She did actually escape in the end. But again, the key point is that it's not just intimate partner violence, it's violence across that whole spectrum or continuum. So what we looked at, what we've looked at in the research, and then what I'm looking at very specifically here, which relates to infrastructure, is the ways in which violence against women is linked across private and public spheres to structural and symbolic violences in different ways. And sort of three key ways that we've identified are in relation to insecure immigration status, which relates to manipulation by partners, by employers, and by the state. So in other words, various forms of structural and symbolic violence. Lack of language competence, manipulation by partners, again, the same. Employers, state, potentially society as well. And there's just some examples from someone that we spoke to about the fact that they felt isolated because they didn't speak the language. Also, they've been de-skilled, deprofessionalised. And also racism, everyday racism and institutional racism. This can entail lots of different things, potentially intersectional, essentialising, stereotyping by partners, and that's if the partner wasn't from Brazil or from the country that they came from. And there's just an example here in relation to British men, which is about the way in which Brazilian women are often essentialised as sexy, sex worker, and so on. And then so women have to actually deal with that as well, invariably, say, at different levels, from the intimate to the public. So in terms of service provision then, and I just wanted to put this sort of translocal perspective in. It's very important to think translocally. And we asked women, these are all the Brazilian women, about disclosure and reporting in London and disclosure and reporting back home. And again, this is probably what one would expect, in that there was lower levels of disclosure in London, presumably because social networks were smaller than there were in Brazil, but higher levels of reporting. But we need to disaggregate that, which I will. Much lower levels of reporting in Brazil. And the example here from the bottom is thinking, and this is the sort of the transnational lens, which is important, which is women saying, nobody ever did anything for me back home, so why is anybody going to do anything for me here in the UK? And the diagram which is just relating to our survey, which is people thinking nothing would be done, lack of information, shame, and fear of deportation. And I'll talk about that more as we go through. So this, the work on, with the Brazilian women with LORS then also led into another project that I mentioned with women from lots of different migrant backgrounds, and resulted in this work that we just launched last month called The Right to Be Believed. This was working very specifically with women with active insecure immigration status, but also who had experienced violence. So what we found is that women felt marginalised, afraid of the police and social services when they had insecure immigration status. They were afraid that their details would be passed on to the Home Office, because that happened a lot. We came across cases where women themselves, either the police wouldn't do anything and would ignore them, which is the case of the Mexican women below, or even cases where they, because women didn't speak English, they went to the police and they ended up in prison cells overnight, because the man who could speak, the intimate partner who could speak English, managed to persuade the police that the woman had actually perpetrated the violence, unbelievably. But it wasn't even an isolated incident. This came up several times. However, on the other side, so this is obviously very, very obvious, clear infrastructural violence. But also, we need to think more positively. Non-statutory service infrastructure is often a real lifeline for migrant women. In terms of Latin Americans, and Laura is one of my PhD students who's working with me, works for this organisation called the Latin American Women's Aid. There are only 2 organisations in the UK that work to provide support for Latin American women. There are officially 250,000 nationally Latin Americans, but probably more than that. But these organisations provide a real lifeline. So, again, so I've told you about sort of really how difficult things are, apart from the last slide. But what I wanted to finish off with is also thinking about resistance, challenging and confronting. And so this is where the Step Up Migrant Women work came in with LAWRS. And this was a campaign which basically has been lobbying Parliament with its most recent domestic abuse bill. And the most recent draft was just published in June. It's in June now, at the beginning of this month. What we did is we did some research associated with this to provide the evidence, because again, as we all know, policymakers won't do anything until we have this evidence base. And then what we've been calling for through this campaign is to separate out women's rights when they experience violence from their immigration rights, and to prevent the police and social services from passing on information to the border agency, the Home Office, and so on. And what was a sort of a win this month was the fact that this bill now includes a whole section on migrant women. Obviously, it hasn't gone through the whole sort of parliamentary system yet, but it was a really important win for the campaign. And again, in terms of Iona speaking about the need to think through the policy implications of the work that we're doing, this is what we've been trying to do here in London as well. Also, and again, I think this very much links into the work of the Disconnected Infrastructures project, we've also been doing artistic work, and in this case with the CASA Latin American Theatre Festival, and we created a verbatim theatre play called Ephemera on using the testimonial interviews, so using the in-depth interviews with the Brazilian migrant women. And we created this play, which we put on in London and Brighton, and we also took it to Rio. And we took it to the favela and put it on in the favela that the Brazilian team are working on in Rio de Janeiro. Then, and again, if I've got time, I've got a 1-minute clip. So we made a policy film where we used things like animation and stuff, actually, which was just like, here's the key findings from the research. But then we've also made a film that we're now submitting to film festivals, which is we've only just finished. And I just wanted to show you a 1.5-minute clip of this, which I think illustrates, hopefully, what I've been saying. And I should say, this is the play and the film revolve around a documentary filmmaker who is interviewing a Brazilian woman, and she's talking about her experiences. And the words are more or less exactly from the interviews.
Do you need anything?
No, I'm fine.
Have you told anyone?
Only you.
No one else?
Who would believe me?
Did you go to the police?
I can't.
No, it's hard.
No, you have no idea.
The only way to protect you is by reporting him.
I don't trust the police. They'll be on his side.
Why do you think that?
I know it.
Have you tried?
I know they'll be on his side.
They'd help you.
I'm not from here.
It doesn't matter.
You can't understand.
I've seen plenty of cases where...
I'm illegal.
You just don't have the proper paperwork yet, that's all. You're undocumented.
I wish everybody thought like you.
Right, I'm going to leave it there, and then thank you. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to put this up. This was something from the launch of the Right to Be Believed work that we did at City Hall, and again, it's a sort of an animation which sort of summarises the key themes. I won't go through conclusions because I know I've run out of time. So thank you very much.